Greetings, anointed people. They attempted to destroy your name because they were unable to destroy your talent. Unbeknownst to you, the most deadly kind of warfare includes whispers rather than guns. Furthermore, the most savage assaults take place during talks in which you are not invited, not during the day. Disguised as compassion, smear campaigns are spiritual assassinations. And when you are the one who has been selected, the assaults begin when you do something well rather than when you do something bad. Let's take a moment to consider a fact. Psychological research indicates that falsehoods spread 6 times more quickly than the truth, particularly when the truth is awkward and the lie is wonderfully shocking. Imagine, therefore, that you are someone whose mere presence reveals evil. Just think of how quickly they will try to shut you down. This goes beyond mere rumors. Petty jealousy is not what this is. This is a full-scale, well-planned takedown that happens gradually, in public, and sometimes even in a courteous manner. They didn't anticipate that you were created with something they can't fake or remove. *** divine receipts ***. So spoiler alert, it ends poorly for them. Let me just say this before we go into the spiritual underpinnings of why this smear campaign was so disgusting and why its outcome will be harsh. Not for you, but for them. Some of your foes would have PhDs and LinkedIn recommendations by now if pettiness were a career. Don't worry. However, this will be more than simply a message, it will be a mirror. By the conclusion, you'll see why the universe used misinterpretation as a defense mechanism for what they were never able to see. Let's investigate further. #1. They couldn't survive a mirror, so they made up a villain. They couldn't endure a mirror, so they made up a villain. That's what really took place. They were not harmed by you. They weren't betrayed by you. They weren't even your rivals. You demonstrated your entire potential by being talented, unbothered, and transparent. And the storm was sparked by that alone. You see, as long as you question yourself, most people feel at ease. As long as you play little, shrink, question, and second-guess yourself, they can put up with you. However, people get alarmed the instant you begin to stand in your truth and cease acting modestly in order to make them feel superior. Your confidence reflects all they've been fleeing from. Not because you've changed. You turned into a mirror they didn't request. Although you didn't talk in a haughty manner, your presence made their insecurities clear. Although you didn't assault, their darkness was disturbed by your radiance. Your calm spoke louder than their pandemonium, even if you didn't declare war. They were unable to cope with it. Therefore, they chose the simpler path rather of undertaking the difficult inside work, instead of asking, "Why does this person's light make me uncomfortable?" They made you a threat, a liar, a manipulator, and a monster. Because it was more comfortable to tell that tale than to acknowledge that they were never truthful about themselves. Thus, they misrepresented your name, your intentions, and your power as ego and your compassion as control. Not because it was accurate, but rather because it provided them with a cover. To ensure that no one would ever see their own shadows, they required someone else to gaze at you through the mist they produced. The most depressing aspect? Many of them were doing it without even realizing it. For others, being a villain seemed like a means of survival because they were so profoundly wounded and ingrained in self-denial. You know what's crazy, though? You're still here, still standing, still gleaming despite all the falsehoods, the filthy words, the icy looks, and the silent treatments. Because a mirror never forgets its image, even if it is broken. Furthermore, the truth always finds a way to surface via receipts, even when it is buried behind falsehoods. You survived the mirror, but they didn't? Without ever doing a thing, you revealed all they were attempting to conceal, not simply surviving the slander. #2. They wanted you to be erased, not kept silent. They wanted your erasure, not your silence. That's what people overlook. This has nothing to do with a fallout or conflict. This was strategic. Not about we grew apart, or they just changed. It was a mission. You were never meant to reach this point. Once you did, the objective became evident, eliminate you in all relevant ways. Slow down, change your name, take away your influence, and conceal your identity under falsehoods so dense that you yourself would begin to doubt your own existence. Making sure there was nothing left of you to hear was always the goal, not merely to silence you. Their goal was to undermine your credibility so that no one would trust you. They were determined to damage your reputation to the point where even your truth would seem dubious. They wanted you discredited, alienated, and disassembled. They weren't content with you just taking a step back, because you caused too much disruption. It didn't simply shine. It revealed your talent, your vitality, and your clarity. It revealed their deceitful feeling of power, their manipulation, and the little empire they had constructed on false pretenses. And those kinds of people want you invisible, not just gone. This was not an accident. It was intentional. In order to gradually destroy your reputation in the eyes of others, they fed them information about you in little doses, slights here, dubious remarks there. And what exacerbates it? They did it while maintaining a composed expression, grinning, and seeming to be just worried. Beneath it, however, lurked envy masquerading as morality and resentment disguised as prudence. They understood that your quiet was a sign of strength, not weakness. They thus attempted to incite you, make you lose your temper, or for you to respond in a manner that they might use as a weapon. They lied louder when you didn't fall for their trick, because they would damage the version of you that other people saw if they couldn't convince you to ruin yourself. However, they were unaware that human hands could not remove what was divinely allocated. They attempted to remove you, but all they succeeded in doing was removing their access to your grace. The echo of the voice they attempted to quiet will now have to be a part of their lives. 3. The smear was psychological warfare, not just gossip. The slur was psychological warfare, not just gossip. It was planned, deliberate, and designed to shatter you from the inside out. It wasn't a trivial gossip that went out of control. No, it was precisely intended. They understood just which stories to tell, which details of your tale to change, and with whom to sow the seeds, making you doubt yourself, to question your own memories, your own motivations, your own goodness, was the aim, not merely to make other people doubt you. And that is the reason this is so risky. This was not a miscommunication, but a mental game. They murmured their falsehoods rather than shouting them. This is how smear campaigns operate. They move stealthily in corners, during informal talks, or during just between us phone calls. They don't face you directly. They want control rather than the truth. And the power comes from having others doubt you, your integrity, and the truth about what really transpired, not from proving you wrong. It is through doubt, not fists, that psychological warfare is waged. The worst thing is that some of the listeners weren't even malevolent. Simply put, they were readily persuaded and affected by the performance. Indeed, the people in charge of the smear campaign were playing the victim of your alleged brutality while projecting a polished, composed demeanor and sometimes even shedding false tears. However, it was all part of the strategy to skew the story and create enough confusion that people completely give up on finding the truth. This was always about turning you against yourself, not just about turning others against you. It was about making you feel alone, worried, and carrying the burden of a falsehood until you began acting as if it were real. They realized they could attempt to disrupt your psyche if they couldn't eradicate your talent. They didn't, however, account for your inner wisdom, your clarity, or the quiet side of you that resisted letting their cacophony define who you were. It was war indeed. It was painful, yes. You didn't break down, however, and now that's what frightens them. You were meant to collapse. Rather, you worked it out. You recovered. You recalled your identity. And now the truth they couldn't kill is causing their whole plan to fall apart. #4. They attempted to infect your name in addition to attacking it. They tried to infect your name, not simply assault it. Speaking negatively about someone and purposefully damaging their reputation are two different things. What they did was to transform your identity into something poisonous, not only drag your character. They wanted people to dread being associated with you, to question your value, your heart, and your tale, to see you as a walking red flag based on false information masquerading as facts. They didn't simply want people to despise you. This was reputation warfare, not just hate speech. They saw your name as infectious, as if others would lose their comfort or trustworthiness if they were associated with you. So they sowed distrust. For example, they said, "Be careful with them," and "Just watch." They never accused you explicitly, but they meant danger. Because defamation is weaker than suggestion. You can ignore a blatant untruth, but a well-founded doubt? That endures. It spreads. They wanted your name to be greeted with side eyes and raised eyebrows rather than respect and trust. It started very subtly before becoming constant. Even if they didn't know the whole story, They repeated things so often that others began to do the same. The way illness spreads is that not everyone who spreads it is aware that they are doing it. Some only wanted to be protected, while others believed they were defending themselves. Before you knew it, your name was entering rooms before you did, speaking a language you never approved of, and dressing in clothing you never chose. Since they were unable to completely ban you, they attempted to make your name dangerous, to make it something that others shunned, questioned, or discussed behind closed doors. They did this in an attempt to disassociate you from your own authority because they recognized that influence is correlated with name weight. That's why they attempted to make your name weighty in the wrong way, with terror rather than with dignity. What they didn't understand, however, is that a name that is based on truth cannot remain tainted. Although the slander may persist, the best defense is truth. And now, gradually but steadily, the infection is getting better, and everyone is starting to understand that your name conveyed prophecy rather than poison. ####5. Since it wasn't theirs, they made your strength a threat. Since your strength wasn't theirs, they used it as a threat. They felt helpless because of you, not because you were incorrect or because you caused them pain. They gave you a part, but you didn't perform it. They put you in a box with their fears, but you left it. And they were uneasy about it. When they expected you to bow, you didn't. When they refused to give you clearance, you didn't seek confirmation. At that point, they concluded that your strength was dangerous rather than commendable. You walked with confidence. You were clear in your speech. You knew you were correct without any acclaim, and you remained composed when they kept quiet. They couldn't tolerate it. They thought you would wince. They anticipated that you would request permission. However, they had to justify it with distortion rather than reality when you took a bold step without consulting them. They began portraying your strength as pride as a result. Your independence was referred to as a revolt. They referred to your serenity as phony. They stated you were obsessed with your concentration, because your self-control made them realize how little they had, and your clarity revealed their bewilderment. They were unable to see that setting boundaries was an act of healing rather than warfare. You choose to keep your distance from them in order to preserve your sanity, not out of hatred. But they chose to play the victim rather than take responsibility for their part. They said, "You changed." In their viewpoint, however, it is treachery to say, "You stopped needing me to define you." They wanted you to continue reducing yourself, justifying yourself, and creating room for their suffering. However, you halted. You held your ground. Because they believed that you shouldn't ascend, certainly not without their support, permission, or plan, they took offense at that. In actuality, however, your power was always a reflection rather than a threat. Additionally, those who haven't grown theirs find it unbearable to be near those who have. They turned your strength into poison because they were too insecure to develop, not because you were a threat. They continue to attempt to control the narrative as they sit on the sidelines. But your life continues to demonstrate the reality that they are unable to suppress. You were just unquestionably entire. You were never conceited. ###6. They saw this as ritual rather than personal. This was routine, not personal to them. It's much more unsettling because of it. You were just next in line. You weren't the exception. Every time someone enters their space, these individuals follow a pattern, a playbook, or a cycle that involves too much presence, too much truth, or too much light. When they come across someone who is brilliant, unique, and transparent, they flock around them like vultures, not because they did anything wrong, but rather because they dared to be who they are without apologizing. And it poses a danger to those whose identities are based on their performance. They have targeted others before, including you. They just couldn't contain you completely. It became so nasty because of this. Others knelt down, acted little, and pleaded to be allowed to rejoin their sick little group. However, you didn't. Confused yet unfazed, you stood tall, and they were exposed as a result. It seemed like overkill because of this. It wasn't simply that they didn't like you. They had to publicly discredit you in order to set an example and show others what happens when people don't follow their rules. They've done this to others before, but not to you. Not to someone whose calling is too genuine to be faked and whose soul is too loud to be silenced. You were a disturbance to their spiritual environment, not simply a bother. Their toxicity was disturbed by your purity. Their manipulation was amplified by your unwillingness to engage in gossip. Their games were enhanced by your emotional transparency. Thus, the same pattern began: exile, distortion, discreditation, and isolation. Since they are no longer even aware of what they are doing, it is not personal to them. They have made it commonplace. Their method of feeling important is to tear down persons of substance. They feel in control of the turmoil they don't want to confront in themselves because of this routine. However, they made a mistake this time. They chose a heavenly, spiritually equipped someone who could not only endure, but also reveal the cycle. And now that the scapegoat isn't vanishing quietly this time, the pattern is breaking. The identical ritual they have been doing for years is now being undone in front of you as you rise. The holy awoke rather than died. ####7. Under the pretext of concern, they want a public execution. Under the pretext of compassion, they want a public execution. That was the whole plan. They arrived in performance, with troubled tones, inclined heads, and quiet voices, not in rage. It seemed concerned. I don't want to start anything, but people should know. I'm just saying this because I care. It sounded sympathetic. However, it was blatant sabotage masquerading as civility. They hinted rather than explicitly stated. They recommended rather than directly attacked. And they painted a picture of you in that area of well-placed clues that was more hurtful than any outright criticism. Because in reality, they were pretending to protect everyone else while preparing others to fear you, doubt your intentions, and see you as unstable, deceptive, or covertly deadly. In reality, they were planning your takedown without getting their hands dirty, but they wanted it to seem as if they were protecting the community from you. There are several fingerprints on the handle of the sword, but no blood on it. It was planned, deliberate, and you seemed more guilty the more you attempted to justify yourself. The trap included that. In the hopes that nobody would notice they were the ones carrying the matches, they started the fire and then stepped off to the side and yelled, "See? They're burning." This was character assassination concealed by phony virtue. It was neither honesty nor accountability. And the most terrifying aspect? Because of the smooth delivery, the fact that the poison was disguised as compassion, and the fact that many people would prefer to accept a falsehood delivered in a kind manner than a truth delivered in a fiery manner, some people bought it. You were framed in addition to being assaulted. Additionally, any attempt you made to explain yourself was misconstrued as more proof against you. They want you destroyed, but they want it to seem as if you did it yourself. That's how these types of campaigns operate. In this manner, they may seem to be innocent while you suffer. They didn't anticipate that you would survive the scenario, however. You outlived their story, not died in it. Envy, manipulation, and fear of the authority they worked so hard to eradicate are now showing through the same mask of concern that they previously wore. ###8. The falsehoods they spread about you were projections they were unable to control. You were never the subject of the falsehoods they told about you. They were projections, sloppy mirror images of their own unresolved injuries masquerading as charges. Unaware of it, they were talking about themselves in every insult, perverted rendition of your truth, and passive-aggressive remark. They were disclosing their own character, not describing yours. However, they threw their baggage on you and called it insight rather of facing it internally. They lied to themselves before they lied to others. They chose you because those falsehoods had to fall someplace. You turned into the ideal painting. You were clear, bright, and present. They didn't respect it, however, because they were dark and couldn't handle the contrast, not because you were. Their pandemonium was reflected in your tranquility. Their deception was revealed by your genuineness. Their dysfunction became louder because of your recovery. In order to feel balanced, they had to skew you. The worst aspect is that they began to believe the falsehoods themselves. They revised the narrative to cheer themselves up when they saw your kindness, but couldn't handle it since the brain can't handle too many contradictions. Lies became their reality because truth made them feel too tiny. She's not kind, she's manipulative. He's not confident, he's arrogant. They're not growing, they're changing for the worse. However, the fact that your picture was their mess persisted despite their best efforts to repaint you. After a while, individuals realized that the brushstrokes didn't reflect your reality. Nothing in your emotions, your deeds, or your energy matched what was being spoken. Because falsehoods, no matter how often they are said, cannot maintain the vibration of truth, which has a frequency. They attempted diversion rather than just slander. They created a fake version of you and persuaded others to react to it rather than the real you because they needed a scapegoat to avoid looking in the mirror. However, the illusion is already dissolving. The true story is coming to light slowly but surely. People are starting to see that you were the vessel, not the villain. And the tale they told was about their inability to face their own darkness, not about yours. ############################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################### the fire, they pretended to be the smoke's victim. They were that manipulative. They started the commotion, stoked the gossip, and whispered the falsehoods to the appropriate people before removing themselves from the scene, as if they had nothing to do with the devastation. They were hoping to see you burn. They screamed for help when the flames reached a certain point, as if they were trapped in something you caused. Your name, your character, and your tranquility were all established by them. Behind closed doors, they stoked the drama, fueled the suspicions, and started the murmurs. However, they switched roles as the heat approached. All of a sudden, it was your actions that caused them such pain. They now need protection, affirmation, and support, not because they were sincere victims, but rather because they were talented actors. Additionally, the audience became engrossed in the act, even if they weren't perceptive. Wolf, they yelled, but they were the wolf. The trap was that the more you defended yourself, the more they used it as evidence that you were the issue, and each time you attempted to explain, they would turn it into, "You're attacking me now." Without acknowledging that they were the ones with the blade in the first place. They want the compassion of being hurt. They used their own falsehoods as a weapon and referred to it as emotional harm. Given the nature of fire, they were aware that the smoke would spread. Lies travel, develop, and spread. They don't simply remain where they're ignited. They also relied on the mayhem to hide their identities. But truth doesn't perish in fire, it persists. They anticipated the pandemonium would be so loud that nobody would think to question, "Wait, who started this?" It simmers. It also has a fragrance. People who begin tracking down the source of the smoke discover that it was the ones posing as innocent, not the person they were instructed to be afraid of. As the dust settles, it is becoming brutally plain that they were the architects, not the victims. Additionally, the very fog that they believed would conceal them is beginning to undermine their credibility. Because truth always finds its way home, even if it doesn't move quickly. ####10. The universe documented more the more they lied. The universe recorded more the more they lied. They didn't understand they were permanently inking their own demise while they were busy attempting to bury you with lies. Not only was it a rumor, but every charge, slander, and distorted version of your reality was a receipt, a spiritual paper trail, and a record being kept, not by you, but by someone far more patient and accurate. In reality, they were carving their own treachery into something cosmic and irrevocable, even if they believed they were wiping out your legacy. They thought it would become the truth if they shouted it loudly, often, and with enough false conviction. However, truth just waits and is not destroyed by repetition. It waits for the commotion to subside. It waits for the passage of time. And when it does reappear, it does so with a clarity that like a razor pierces through every falsehood. They didn't anticipate that. They forgot that the truth always wins out in the long run because they were so preoccupied with maintaining control of the situation. The cosmos took notice when they lied on your name rather than simply watching it happen. All of your character twists and attempts to portray you as unstable, self-centered, or harsh were captured on tape. Spiritual law endures forever, unlike human memory, which deteriorates with time. They didn't even realize they were authoring your vindication. What's the most ironic about it? The purpose of the falsehoods they said was to ruin your future, but now they are the same evidence showing their patterns, their jealousy, and their dread of what you are carrying. The more they lied, the more their true identities were exposed. Because falsehoods are short-lived. For a time, they can run, but ultimately, their own weight causes them to collapse. The retribution is now gradual but certain. People are asking, why were they so obsessed with destroying someone who stayed silent? Why did they try so hard to control the narrative? And why, even after everything, do you still stand tall with peace and integrity, as the very stories they used to discredit you begin to come apart? This is because the truth didn't need to be defended, it was being documented. Those entries are now becoming evidence. ###11. Your seclusion was planned, not just happened. Your seclusion was planned, not unplanned. Your social circle wasn't rearranged by the cosmos at random. It didn't simply happen. It was a methodical, lengthy procedure that was intended to deprive you of credibility, support, and connections. They wanted you to be alone in every way, spiritually, socially, and emotionally, rather than simply feeling alone. Because it is simpler to suppress, discredit, and destroy someone who is disengaged. They attempted to put you far enough away from everyone else so, should they attempt to break you, no one would be able to hear you scream since they knew they couldn't do it directly. Be careful with them. I've heard some things, and something just feels off about them lately. They didn't approach you with outward animosity, but rather with quiet persuasion. They utilized suggestion, subtle remarks, and phony concern to get others to start moving away from you one by one. They sow uncertainty and let it take care of the rest. And the most agonizing aspect? A portion of it was successful. Those you cared about become wary. Not because you changed, but because someone they trusted hinted that you did. People who had previously believed you began to doubt their assumptions. This is how manipulation operates. It just requires repetition and enough noise to make stillness seem suspicious, not proof. They intended to demolish you, not just isolate you. They intended you to sit in that silence, doubt your value, ponder what went wrong, and then collapse. The objective was to crush your spirit by strategically, slowly, and silently severing your connections, not by force, but by corrosion. However, they were unaware that isolation would turn into your activation. The seclusion they created became a hallowed area. You gained clarity when the throng was gone. You recalled your identity. You made a new one. And now, not because of them, but in spite of them, the version of you that they attempted to destroy is more powerful than ever. And those who once retreated, they are beginning to pick up on the story's flaws. The quiet is becoming loud. The truth is coming to light again. Additionally, the light that they had thought would go out in private is now too brilliant to ignore. 12. They hoped you wouldn't because they knew the truth would outlive the lies. They just hoped you wouldn't because they knew the truth would survive the falsehoods. The slander campaign was never intended to last. In the back of their minds, they knew that someday the truth would surface, the facts would be revealed, and people would begin to make connections. However, it wasn't the purpose. Their objective was to ensure that you did not survive the short game, not to win the long one. They just counted on you breaking before the reality could catch up with you, not that it would remain concealed forever. People don't grasp that section. It was more about wearing you down emotionally, spiritually, and mentally until you stopped attempting to change the story, stopped defending yourself, and vanished than it was about persuading the world forever. They intended your power to be outlived by the untruth. They wanted it to infect more individuals than your truth could reach and spread more quickly than your voice. Because they wouldn't have to deal with your real tale ever coming to light if they could force you to collapse. Because of who you are rather than what you did, you posed a danger. In order to prevent the truth from ever breathing, they had to murder your spirit. Thus, they lied, twisted, and pushed. They disparaged your reputation, your intentions, and your moral character. And they carried it out with assurance because they had one belief, that the harm would ultimately outweigh your ability to bounce back. You didn't break, however. You didn't fold. You could have tripped, sobbed, became silent, or even asked yourself questions. However, you did not vanish. Even when the untruth encircled your reputation like a noose, you remained upright. It's the lie now, not you screaming for oxygen. It is losing momentum, force, and oxygen. Something significant is also taking place as the smoke clears. People are beginning to see the flaws in the narrative they were given. They are beginning to inquire. They also realize that the individual that is still standing, talking, and glowing was never the bad guy. Not only did you survive the falsehood, but you also demonstrated that your spirit was uncompromising. They now had a deteriorating story and the echoes of a reality they attempted to conceal. ####13. Your return is a divine indictment, not a redemption. Your return is a divine condemnation, not a sign of salvation. You're not running back to clear your reputation or pleading with those who attempted to destroy you for approval. You are not here to refute their misrepresented version of your tale or to argue your point. The truth is now using you as proof, which is why you are coming up. You're returning to prove that what they did to you was based on fear and falsehoods, not to get praise. They said that your reputation was irreparable and that you were done. But because of how badly it failed, not because of the smear, you are here, flourishing, shining, and rising. Just your presence exposes their dishonesty. Your presence, without a word, exposes everything they attempted to conceal, that they were manipulative, that they lied, and that they made up a story out of insecurity rather than reality. This is about the initial truth at last assuming its proper position. It is not about a second opportunity. You don't need retribution. You don't even need their approval. The judgment is already there if you are living in your power, your purpose, and your calm. Because their whole campaign was predicated on the idea that you wouldn't make it through, that you would crumble under the strain, or that you would remain hidden, embarrassed, or damaged. However, you didn't. Every lie they have spun about you now seems weaker. It sounds more pitiful with each whisper behind your back, because you wouldn't still be here if even half of what they stated were true. However, you are. That you didn't fold, that you didn't destroy yourself, and that you rebuilt without their consent or assistance is what they find intolerable. It's exposure, not simply resiliency, that makes your comeback. It is proof. They're trying to bury everything, and this is a spiritual subpoena. To keep the deception alive, they wanted you gone. Now that you're in plain sight, the falsehood is gasping. The true author edits in truth, not fear, yet they wanted to play God with your tale. You are the evidence that they never have the power they believe they did, and you are not only winning. ##### 14. The pen was never theirs, even if they wrote your ending. The pen was never theirs, yet they penned your finale. They believed they had the power to determine the course of your tale. They believed that their carefully constructed portrayal of you, their falsehoods, and their smear campaign would be the last chapter. But they failed to see that true destiny responds to alignment rather than loud lips. They wanted to be the narrators, the editors, and the ones who got to announce, that's the end of them. Additionally, they never owned the ink, regardless of how many pages they attempted to tear from your life. Because they stopped reading, they assumed you were done and closed the book on you too soon. They each had their own account of events, including the exile, failure, and demise. They took care to disseminate it widely. They wanted everyone to leave feeling the same way, that you were lost, that you were unstable, and that your light had gone out. However, life was silently altering the screenplay while they were busy with your burial. Because story twists are discreetly delivered by destiny rather than being announced. Now look at you, still standing, still rising, renewed, not shattered. You weren't intended to create it in accordance with their version, therefore it's confusing them. You were meant to remain little, humiliated, and forgotten. However, your existence suddenly goes against their predictions, which is causing the whole phony narrative to fall apart. You didn't have to yell, which is the beauty. You didn't have to plead for the truth to come to light or battle for your reputation. You just continued to live. The unwavering, steadfast, and untouchable truth did what it usually does. It waited before speaking for itself. The same story they attempted to write is now suffocating them. Do you need my assistance with anything else today?